All right, everybody. Well, we'll go ahead and get started tonight. Welcome. I think we've got a few folks that are joining us for the first time tonight, so we welcome you to our Monday musing sessions. I think this is number 28 or 29 for the year, so this one is our next to last. We end up next week with origins of holiday plants. But tonight we're going to be focusing on herbal remedies for the home and a little bit for the garden. I got a little bit carried away. So for those of you that have been attending regularly, I've been telling you for a couple of weeks now that after next week's class, y'all are going to get a survey and an evaluation to fill out. So hopefully y'all will take advantage of that opportunity. If you want to see these continue in 2021 and just put some ideas on paper, because especially the last few Mondays and then this week and next week, they're a little bit shorter and it's a lot of material. So you've heard me say it more than once, we're just scratching the surface of some pretty broad topics. So if anything really piques your interest or whets the appetite, make sure you jot that down and include that in that evaluation next week, because hopefully next year we can get a little bit more centered in on plant specifics, or maybe some of the things we're talking about tonight, for instance, on the how-tos for utilizing these and things like that, because we're really going to kind of cram a lot of information in what little time that we do have tonight. And I will tell you that when it got to the point that I was putting plants in, I would just close my eyes and randomly pick some, because there are just too many to talk about. And it's just amazing the wealth of attributes each one of these plants give us, and again, there's just too much to go through in such little time. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in here and get started. And probably a lot of you are already growing some of your own herbals, and tonight we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the methodology and maybe a few herbs to get you started. So no matter if you're a novice or if you're more advanced, some of the plants and some of the techniques tonight hopefully are going to maybe at least just serve as a reminder how to carry forward with some of this. So I wanted to start us out with some terminology, because often when we talk about utilizing herbs, there's a lot of different ways we can use them. For many folks that are not used to growing herbs or using herbs from their garden, they may only think of herbs being used as a tea. That seems to be general knowledge from friends of mine that are not really experienced in growing herbs, but there's so much more that we can use them for. So when we start digging a little bit deeper, we start using some of these terms you see here. And I'm just going to try to go over some of these, but not get really in depth. So sometimes you'll hear the word decoction, and the big difference there with some of the other terminology we use is that this is a plant material extraction made through boiling or simmering. An elixir is going to have a sweetener that's going to be added to it. Think about some of the elderberry syrups that we're using, but usually honey is going to be that sweetener. A hydrosol, that's what we call an aromatic water. They're just going to be less concentrated than essential oils. An infusion is going to be a drink or a remedy or extract made by soaking that plant material in a liquid, and it's usually going to be water. When you hear the term materia medica, that's a term for the body of knowledge collected about materials that are going to be used for their therapeutic properties. And this is a huge resource that I use for tonight, the one I was shutting my eyes and just kind of picking the plants from. So in our case, it's specific herbs. A poultice, that's just a mass of plant material that we're applying topically to an area on our body. And then a tisane is what truly we term an herbal tea. That's that extraction of a plant material, and we're extracting it in hot water. A tincture, we're going to use that using vinegar, which is usually apple cider vinegar or an alcohol. And then a tonic is just a huge mix of different herbs that's going to help strengthen and invigorate the body. So to go a little bit more into detail with some of those, this one here is just extracting medicinal compounds from the seeds, the roots, or the stems. And this is when we're making that I can't talk tonight, y'all, decoction. And that's just when we're boiling those herbs down, and we're going to be able to pull the strength of those plants a little bit better, especially more those woody type plants, woody type herbs. So what I've done is included some different links in this PowerPoint to websites are going to have some different recipes for these decoctions because again there's just so many. So some of the ones that I've included are some of the ones that I use as a go-to pretty regularly, that I know other friends have utilized these as well. Again, when we talk about an elixir, the big difference there is that they do have that sweetener added. Usually that's going to be honey. When we talk about the hydrosols, again, that's just that aromatic water. They're going to be produced by distilling fresh leaves. So when we say distilling, that's a lot like how moonshine is made. You know, for instance, the lavender hydrosol that you see there, you'll get just a little tiny bit of the true essential oil when you go through the distilling process. That's one reason essential oils are so much more expensive. But what's left after that distillation process is actually the hydrosol. So if you are purchasing essential oils, make sure that they are in fact essential oils rather than just simply the aromatic water or the hydrosol. When you compare the aromas, hydrosol is not going to be quite as intense as those essential oils. When we talk about infusions, again, some people will refer to this as a tea. There's many different recipes out there for some of these infusions and decoctions again, but usually a simple one there on the left, lime, cucumber, and basil is just a simple infusion. There on the right is another simple, just utilizing sage and blackberry. So you're just basically steeping those plant materials either in warm water, hot water, or even in cool water. And again, there's a couple of recipes included in there. A poultice, this is actually plantain. Y'all hear me talk about plantain all the time. So this is actually utilized using a mortar and pestle here to crush up the plantain leaves and create that poultice to go on the rash. And you actually, just like seen here, will directly apply that oftentimes to the wound or to a bruised area. Tisane. Oops, I thought that was me. Anyway, tisane is a tea. So when we think about tea, that's anything from the camellia species. So white, green, black tea, even oolong tea, yellow tea, all that comes from a variety of the true tea plant. The difference here is when we're utilizing herbs, like you see pictured here, the chamomile. That's not technically a tea, that's why it's referred to as a tisane. So if you hear that a little bit different, that's why. Basically, that's just utilizing fresh or dried leaves, any portion of the bark, the root, or the seed, or even the flowers, like you see here, to make that drink. There's going to be a big difference too in the brewing. When you make tea, you know, you have to let that water boil for an extended period of time. You don't want to do that with some of these herbal tisanes. There's a certain amount of time. You don't want to always have boiling water, and each one of those are going to be plant specific. So make sure you follow directions on that to reap the most benefit from whatever herb you're is going to contain caffeine, whereas the tisanes are generally caffeine free. So that's another big difference. Here's just another picture of, this is called the red bush tea, or and I can't say this like in South Africa, Rooibos tea. It's not truly a tea. It is, in fact, what you see pictured here. It is the red bush tea. Very high in minerals, especially iron, high in calcium and potassium. So that's why a lot of people prefer that red bush tea to some of our normal everyday black teas. These are tinctures that you see pictured in just normal mason jars. You don't have to be fancy about some of these things. You're basically combining powdered or cut herbs to alcohol, which you see pictured here. You can use vodka, gin, brandy, rum, even glycerin is utilized oftentimes. And when you make a tincture, you'll usually let that sit for a couple of weeks. You got to shake it a few times daily. You don't want it to get too hot. You don't want it to get too cold, but after that 2 weeks, you'll strain that off and bottle it into little droppers. So it's really easy to make a tincture, but it's not going to be quite as concentrated, again, as those essential oils that you might be purchasing. And then a tonic, you can see some of the plants listed there: dandelion, licorice, nettle, hawthorn, astragalus, and rose. So basically a tonic is going to be a combination of several different herbs that we're going to utilize for systems or support within the body. Again, they are going to be steeped in water, and then they're going to be drunk either hot or cool, again, just depending on which herbs you're utilizing. So there's a couple of different recipes, if you will, that are going to be linked on each one of these slides. So make sure you check it out for some of the simpler or more simple ones that you can create at home utilizing herbs you're probably already growing. As we move through the next few slides, just a few points to ponder, and we're going to touch on each one of these, but we want to just make sure that we're using remedies safely. We probably prefer growing organically. We don't want to be adding chemicals to any of those tinctures, tonics, any of the salves, anything like that. We want to know when the best time is to harvest, and some plants are going to have different times to harvest depending on which part of that herb you're going to utilize. And then a little bit of discussion on dried versus fresh. Just a reminder, from a Tennessee Extension Master Gardener standpoint, where we don't teach or comment on the medical plant production topics, and we don't teach or comment on any modern medicinal uses. We try to keep it within our mission and expertise, and teach about those historical aspects and the horticultural aspects of the culinary herb. So a lot of the stuff you're going to see presented tonight is a lot of historical content, because we all know that a lot of these herbs and plants were being utilized years before modern pharmaceutical companies came into play. So using herbs safely, and what else do we mean by that? Make sure, because again, there are so many herbs, so many plants that can contribute to some of these herbal remedies. So we want to make sure we're doing research. We want to make sure that we're using the correct plant. Number one, we want to be using it safely. So for instance, I've asked people before what this plant was, and I've been told that it's pokeberry or elderberry. Well, elderberry, we all know, is one that we can utilize much more effectively and safely than what we can poke. So this is in fact elderberry. Elderberry does have those antiviral components and the properties, often used for treatment in the flu, but you have to cook these before use. That's a critical point. So that's one thing we mean when we say use these herbal remedies safely. If you consume raw elderberries, it can cause a little digestive upset, vomiting, that kind of thing. So you have to be really careful. Again, just make sure you do your research before using these plants. We want to, again, grow organically. One of the primary benefits, again, of growing your own is just being able to control that garden environment. You don't want to be ingesting any chemical residue, and try to use natural methods for pest control as much as possible, which a lot of these herbs that we're going to talk about have defense mechanisms built into them. Also a component of that companion plants that we talked about way back in the springtime. When it comes to harvesting, lots of different ways that we can go here. And again, it's hard not to just, I mean, we could spend, a good couple hours just on harvesting alone, but some questions that you want to ask yourself, because, well, first of all, you need to know when to harvest, because that's going to affect the potency of the herbs. It's just going to depend on when you harvest it as to when you're going to reap the most benefit from that plant. So if you are harvesting an herb, say for essential oil, you want to do that first thing in the morning, because that's when the concentration of those oils are so much higher in that plant. You want to harvest those plants when they're at their peak. You don't want to let them kind of, get on the flip side to where they're starting to go down in the garden. You want to pick those at peak, at proper timing. But harvesting, ask yourself these questions. Are you growing this plant or this herb for foliage? If you are, then you need to harvest before they flower. Think about chives in bloom. You can eat those chive blooms in a salad, but if you let the chives flower, then it can cause the foliage to develop an off flavor. So again, it kind of depends on which part of that plant you're going to use. If you're wanting the seeds, you want to harvest as the seed pods change in color from that green to brown or that green to gray just before they actually shatter open. If you're collecting flowers like borage or chamomile, then you want to collect them before they completely flower out. So they've just started flowering is when you want to harvest. And then what about the bloodroots, the chicories, the ginseng, golden seal, all those forest botanicals we've talked about? You want to harvest in the fall after the foliage fades. So now is a good time to actually be harvesting some of those. You want to harvest when that herb has enough foliage to maintain growth. So up to about 75% of the current season's growth can be harvested at one time. This, I'll take it back to the ramps because I didn't include this in the presentation tonight, but you know, you've heard me mention before not to harvest the entire bulb of the plant. You can actually harvest sections of that leaf and it still be just as beneficial to you as the bulb. So kind of keep that in mind. Again, harvest early in the morning after the dew dries, but before the heat of day. If you harvest before flowering, then leaf production will not decline. And then again, you see there, their most intense oil concentration is harvested after those buds appear, but just before they're fully open. So keep all that in mind. Some folks will actually grow herbs just for craft purposes. So again, pick before they're fully open. You can leave annual herbs to be harvested until it frosts. And then keep clipping those perennial herbs all the way up until late August, but stop about a month before the frost date, because otherwise it can completely kill that plant back if we were to get a heavy freeze. Dried versus fresh, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this toward the end of the presentation, but when you're making natural remedies, you need to pay really close attention to the ratio. For many of these herbs, those chemical properties, remember going back to our phytochemistry talk a few weeks ago, some of those compounds are going to become more concentrated when that plant is dried, like you see here on the right. And also remember that shelf life is going to affect potency as well as flavor. So when we start tasting that aftertaste, then that can often indicate to us that shelf life is a little past due. So let's get into some of the favorites. You've seen probably all of these at some point if you've been attending all these classes. So hopefully a lot of this is going to come full circle. But this is the calendula or the pot marigold. This is one that's going to be utilized often as a base, as a carrier for a lot of the salves with some of the other plants that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. Excuse me, calendula is touted for being an antiseptic, it's antifungal. It's considered to be a huge ally for any kind of open wound. The petals, of course, can be utilized in a salad. It's an annual, but it reseeds freely, so it's a great addition to any garden. It really does like full sun. You want to harvest those petals again when they're fresh, though, but then you can dry the entire bloom and collect seeds from that. The other cool thing about calendula is that it's a great plant to make soap from. So if you're interested there's a soap recipe that I've included in the slideshow. Here is my most loathed herb, but I put it in there here for all of you cilantro lovers. You know, some of us, I think, have that gene where it tastes like dish soap to us, but I recognize its attributes. It is a fine plant. It's got a lot of great health qualities. It's a pretty easy plant to grow. And again, that flavor is going to be one that either people love or hate. But so many different uses for this. But the thing is, a lot of folks don't really realize that it is considered a medicinal herb. It is a pretty powerful digestive aid, and it can remove heavy metals and other toxic agents from the body. It will bolt in hot weather, so keep that in mind. So remember on harvesting. So basil is our go-to for making pesto a lot of times, but if you really like the flavor of cilantro, this can be utilized in a lot of different pesto recipes. So there's one of those included in here. This is one you've heard me mention several times. This is lemon balm or Melissa that folks in England actually call this Melissa. So this is one of those bitter herbs. It's got a high essential oil content. It does have tannins. Remember, that's what gives it that chew. It's got a very relaxing effect on the stomach and the nervous system. It can help fight off viruses. Herpes is one that they've looked at for that if it's used topically. And there's a research study that's embedded in your slideshow, so make sure to read that. It's pretty cool. Lemon balm or the Melissa is pretty tasty. You can utilize it in any of those teas. Children can even ingest this without any type of issue if it's got that glycerin base rather than alcohol. This is called a positive energy herb because it is very calming and uplifting, and it does produce a really pretty lush green foliage anywhere in the garden. This is one though you have to be careful about because it will lose shelf life after about 6 months. If you dry this plant, it's not really going to be any good. Melissa, just as an FYI, I don't think I've ever mentioned this before. It's Greek for bee, B-E-E, buzzing bee. So that's just a little tidbit of information. But this is one of the most popular herbs that's been used in a lot of herbals for thousands of years. It is a member of the mint family, so if you do plant it, remember it grows and can take over the universe, so be really careful with that. Kind of keeping in line with the mints, this is peppermint and spearmint. Of course, you're going to find these in both toothpaste, chewing gums. It is going to provide that little bit of zing. It can be considered nature's sweetener. And oftentimes peppermint is going to be used a little bit more because it does provide a little bit stronger essential oil, has a little bit higher potency than its cousin, the spearmint. So just kind of keep that in mind. You can apply this topically as a lotion or a salve. Again, you have to be really careful. Don't let it get out of hand in your garden. But there is a link in there on some cool facts about peppermint. It's not just what we utilize in hard candy or the candy canes at Christmas time. So we're actually going to speak a little bit more about peppermint next week, as we are rosemary, but we have to mention rosemary because it is a very strong medicinal herb. It's considered the great reviver. It's a woody herb. It helps stimulate stimulates energy and optimism, and it's always been touted to sharpen memory and concentration because it allows you to bring more oxygen into your brain. So if you have an aversion to caffeine, rosemary is one, especially sniffing rosemary. It can really sharpen your senses. It is considered a drought tolerant plant as well. Sometimes it can be a little finicky in the South. Depends kind of on the winter. You often have to kind of find it a happy spot, if you will. A hard freeze can kill rosemary back. If you simmer rosemary on the stove, it's a good way to freshen the entire house. If you mix it with citrus, especially this time of year with grapefruit, it is really, really nice to smell that in the house. And again, just kind of is invigorating. It is too a culinary herb, so it's used often in meat dishes. And again, it helps with memory and blood pressure. It's also touted for that. This is mullein. So this is one you either think it's a nice addition or you just don't like it, but it does serve a pretty good purpose. It does have soothing properties that can help heal a cough or any kind of respiratory infection. Usually the leaves are added to a cough elixir, and so I have included that link in there. It's very simple to make that. Doesn't take a lot of time to do that. Mullein is going to be kind of like parsley or the wild carrots. It is a biennial, so you're going to get a lot of foliage that first year, and then you're going to get the flower spikes the next. It can get really tall, 6 foot tall, so make sure if you do plant this to give it lots of room. This one here is thyme. This is one that is no stranger to us. It's been around since the Middle Ages. Many stories and lore say that it was utilized to enhance bravery and ward off nightmares. But the biggie now is that it does have antiseptic and antibacterial properties. And so if you actually make a tincture with thyme oil, it can actually help during the flu season to kind of boost the immune system. Whoops, I lost my other picture. Okay. Well, I don't know where it went there. Sorry about that. But anyway, thyme, all in all, is one of the better plants that you can use in your garden. It is a low grower. So when we go back to that companion planting theme, if we've got low growing plants like that, it can serve as a habitat for some of those beneficials like ground beetles. And that's one thing we want to do, is draw in some of those beneficial populations. It will spread really nicely. It's very fragrant. It's a good pollinator plant in the spring. And again, a lot of even modern day herbalists forget that thyme does have a lot of beneficial properties. Some will even make a tincture of this or a tonic and use it to gargle for sore throat. We have to mention lavender, and there's so many different cultivars, so many different species of lavender. Most would recognize lavender as being relaxing and calming. It yields a very nice essential oil, as well as a hydrosol. It's used in sachets and sleep pillows. It's used in bath salts. It can alleviate tension, anxiety, and stress, and has been said to help with even sunburns and, of course, insomnia. It is a woody plant, so harvesting is going to be a little bit different than some of our fresher herbs. So make sure, again, that you research that and know which part of the plant and what specifically you're using it for. So you can kind of see why we're cramming a lot into tonight, because, again, we could probably spend just an hour or two on lavender alone and all the different ways that we could utilize it from the garden. But I did put a recipe or a how-to in there on how to make a sachet, a sleep pillow. This is chamomile. This is one that's very popular for the teas. It does have that really delicate apple-scented fragrance, which makes it very nice. It's not an ineffective plant. Some people claim that chamomile is not, it doesn't have any place in the herbal medicine chest, but it is one of the best herbs, according to a research study, which the link is in there, for treating colic and stomach issues in children. And then a chamomile tea, if you have children, Peter Rabbit's mother fixed him that after his stressful chase in Mr. McGregor's garden, just as an FYI. People will also use the chamomile for a sleep aid, easing digestion again. In 26 countries actually now recognize this plant in their pharmacopoeia, so for utilizing this for certain ailments. And again, that research study goes into some more in-depth about that, so I'm not going to share all that, but you can go back and read that. Oregano, I should have put this one after thyme, because often we'll grow these together. So oregano is one that probably all of you are growing. It's one that just pretty well spreads like crazy. It goes crazy. It's one that you really want because it is a good antibacterial plant. Plus, it's a fabulous culinary herb. It's used in so many different cooking dishes, but it's considered nature's antibiotic as well. And a lot of folks don't realize that it's used in facial products too, to help with some of those like acne and what is that other skin disorder? I can't remember what that's called. Rosacea and some of those type skin issues as well. Many probably wouldn't put cayenne pepper in the classification as an herb, but kind of like we learned last week about Thanksgiving, what we term some vegetables today, our ancestors actually termed those herbs. So the pepper is one of those. So of course, cayennes, we can dry those and use those as crushed red pepper. They add spice to a lot of different foods. They've been said to increase circulatory issues in the body. It is a homeostatic herb. It's just helping slow heart attacks, just a lot of many different uses. It's also a very attractive plant growing in the garden. And of course, this time of year is when folks start making the famous fire cider. So there is a recipe in there for fire cider along with one of our other favorite herbs, which is garlic. And again, we have so many different cultivars of this that we can grow, but so many benefits from heart health to treating colds and flus. Garlic is where it's at. It actually helps stimulate the immune system, helps actually increase the production of white blood cells. There's a research study in there that you can read about that. It's also being researched for type 2 diabetes, so that's maybe something on the horizon for that. And Hippocrates loved garlic. This was his favorite medicinal herb. And you already heard me mention plantain earlier. This is just what I call the beast, along with calendula and comfrey, so many different things that you can utilize plantain for. There is a recipe in there for a plantain salve. It's going to include using it with calendula and comfrey, or using 2 of the 3, or just using 1. But any of those are going to be great topicals to add for wound care. The big difference there is if you're using comfrey, you want to make sure that wound is clean, because it will seal the skin really good. But if you have any type of infection in there, it's going to seal that in too. So you want to be really careful with that. Chickweed, again, this is probably one that many are not going to plant deliberately. It's one of those that's germinating right now that a lot of folks are trying to eradicate in their lawns. They don't want to see this in the springtime, but this is one of those early spring tonics. So remember, a tonic is going to help us stabilize systems and organs in the body. So it's one of those plants that I have often stated it's misunderstood, but it does have some really good medicinal qualities. It is going to help support liver and kidney function. Again, think about when the early settlers were using ramps as a tonic, because it helped cleanse the blood, gets the circulatory system moving again. Many of the same benefits that chickweed is going to yield as well. So you can make a chickweed tea, you can make a chickweed pesto, lots of different things. Plus, it's great for dry skin. Echinacea, this plant's no stranger to us. It's been grown in gardens for centuries, but it does have a high medicinal value. So we know that this is actually one that's usually touted the cure-all. And again, in Germany, this is one that's recognized. It's on the shelves as being an immune booster. It helps ward off viruses. So if you have a lot of coneflower growing, there's a recipe in there for a tincture. And again, when you're growing herbs for tinctures, you're using that to boil that material down, and you're usually taking 10 to 30 drops of that tincture on a daily basis. So you're going to need a little bit higher quality and quantity of those plants to be able to yield a desirable amount. Yarrow, this is one you've heard me talk about before too. It's a member of the aster family. It is one of those perennial flowers that can grow wild. We're not always purposefully planting this one, but this is the one that has the legend that Achilles used it as a poultice to stop the bleeding of the soldiers' wounds during the Trojan War. And it does have a high alkaloid content. It's going to contain about 120 different chemical compounds. And there is one in there, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but it's in the notes, that it actually will alleviate bleeding. It is a blood stop herb. So if you're ever out working in the garden, you nick your finger, just grab you some yarrow leaves and make you a little poultice and stick it directly on there, and it'll stop the bleeding. A lot of folks will also use this as a carrier in salves. You've already heard me mention comfrey. This is going to be one of our first blooming perennials in the springtime, and it'll bloom all year long. So pollinators, the bumblebees, they love this plant. It does spread very rapidly, and some would consider it invasive. But if you're making a lot of those herbal salves, this is one you really want to have in your garden. It does contain allantoin, and that is that compound I was talking about a minute ago that seals those wounds. And if you are prone to bruises, this is a great one to apply to those bruises as well. It'll help heal those a little bit faster. This is black cohosh, sometimes called the skunk plant because it does emit that odor when it's blooming. But this is, again, one of those woodland forest botanicals. This is the women's go-to herb. So you've probably seen this on shelves. So anything, menopause, anything like that, it helps balance out hormones. It was thought by early American settlers to be the main ingredient in witch's brew. So if any female was caught with this, they were actually burned as a witch, because women learned the value of this plant so many years ago, and the settlers just didn't understand its effective use for women's hormonal issues. But there is a recipe in there to make a tincture from the black cohosh. This is one we don't see too often here, but we've got a master gardener here locally that grows the turmeric, and we all know turmeric, especially here in the last few years, has grown just a huge reputation, and many people will drink the golden milk. There's a lot of research behind it saying that it can help inhibit Alzheimer's. It can help with joint pain, lots of different ailments that this plant can help with. So there is a recipe in there for the golden milk. Besides that, it's used often in just herbal teas or in salves, but a lot of good antiviral, or beneficial properties from the turmeric plant. So let's talk a little bit about some of the culinary delights that we can reap from the garden, if you will. So when we're talking about utilizing all these herbs, what are some different ways we can use them? Well, making vinegars is one way to do that. We can make salad dressings. We just want to make sure that those herbs are good and clean, dry. Usually apple cider vinegar is going to be the base to make those with, but usually these herbal vinegars can last up to 6 months in a freezer. Jellies and syrups are a great way to be able to utilize herbs. That's pretty straightforward. Of course, a compound butter. Lovage is one of my favorite. It yields a really nice, delicate flavor, but many different ways that you can use these compounded butters for cooking or just using on breads, biscuits, anything like that. So a couple of recipes in there for that as well. Of course, traditional pesto is made from basil, but we can also use it to make a basil salt. It's a nice finishing salt, and as well as lemon verbena, rosemary, sriracha. So there's some different recipes in there that you can make some of these salts, as well as the sugars. A lot of people don't realize you can take the flowers from many of these herbs and not preserve those, but utilize those in a finishing type sugar. You just want to make sure you crush those flowers like you see there, cover them with the sugar, and they can last several days and yield a great flavor to a lot of your sweet dishes. Ice cubes are a great way. If you have extra herbs, you can freeze those in water, or you can even utilize oil. And then when you're cooking, you can just pop out a cube and have that ready as a go-to. If you're into cocktails, a lot of different ways that you can utilize your favorite vodka to become a great bartender. Just keep a jar of vodka in the refrigerator and just infuse that alcohol. You can make simple syrups. Lots of links in your PowerPoint that you can see how to make some of those, because it is a big deal at a lot of the high-end bars now. I have to tell this story. I did try a lavender martini a couple years ago, and I don't think I'll ever do that again. I felt like I needed to be taking a bath instead of drinking a cocktail. It was pretty rough, but everybody has preferences. But it was very stout, so these botanicals can yield a pretty great flavor. Of course, anytime that we infuse an oil with herbs, we can use those for baking or for bathing. So there's some different recipes in there on how to do that. And I kind of already mentioned the salad dressing, but you can add all kinds of different things to a salad dressing to make it tasty. The recipe that I put in here is using jalapenos. It's a basil chili salad dressing. So if you like spice, make sure to check that out. Of course, making tea or infusing honey is a great addition to any of these herbal tisanes or the teas that we're making. So yields a really nice, delicate flavor to that too. And of course, just making sun tea. And sun tea doesn't have to be made from tea, the camellia plant. We can use this or make sun tea using any of the herbs that we have growing in and around the garden. Lemon balm, lemon thyme, lavender, any of those yield an excellent tea. And so taking it beyond the kitchen, let's go to Bed Bath & Beyond. And again, I already mentioned the oils for cooking, but we can also use those oils for bathing as well. So there's a link to Mountain Rose Herbs in there on how to make a lot of these herbal bath oils. You can also use a hair rinse. Lots of different issues maybe many of us are dealing with, from dandruff to dry hair to oily scalp. So there's a link included there for whatever ails you, using, again, rosemary, thyme, lots of different hair rinses. A lot cheaper to use than buying those $20 bottles at the Walmart. I kind of already touched on this when I showed you calendula, but making soaps are so much easier than maybe a lot of us think. I didn't want to get into this because I thought, oh, that's going to take too much time, energy, and effort, but it's actually pretty easy to get started with that. And then what about the perfumes? I've mentioned the hydrosols several times, or utilizing those essential oils. You can mix those. Of course, one of the biggies is patchouli, the lavender. A lot of those different herbs, again, really clarify and invigorate the body as well. Making homemade bath salts. So here we are getting ready to go into the holiday season. A lot of these are really simple to make. Bath salts or sugar scrubs, either one. They just require a couple of ingredients, and a lot of these plants you probably had growing in your garden, and this is the sugar scrub there. Salt and sugar, of course, are going to be natural exfoliants. Body butters, you see this one here, coconut rose. So using coconut oil as a base, and then using rose hips, and I think it was sage that was utilized in this. But again, the biggest length of time is going to be there pulling that essence, if you will, out of the plant. It takes 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how much that you're making. But the carrier oil, it just takes a little while to do that, and then it's pretty simple to whip up body butter or the lint balms, either one. And these are fairly cheap to purchase on Amazon, and you can use essential oil, or you can use the tinctures or whatever that you have made and make your own. Peppermint, of course, being one of the biggies. I've already mentioned the sachets and the sleep pillows, or the dream pillows, as some people will call them. And a lot of people will make the mist that goes along with that as a gift. Candles, and you can see the lavender actually has been created in those candles. So there's some recipes in there for that. Again, pretty cheap to make some of these. These are room fresheners. Not only are they pretty, but they serve a great purpose, and each one of them has a different benefit. Invigoration to relaxation. So pretty cool on how those can serve as room fresheners. Even dryer sheets. So if you're making your own laundry detergent, you can also make your own dryer sheets and just utilize a different essential oil from herbs that you're growing, whatever scent you like, to infuse those. This is one of my favorite. This is the cleaning essentials. This is utilizing sage. It's an excellent do-it-yourself, using vinegar as a base, but sage is really wonderful antibacterial, antiviral properties to cleanse the kitchen area and stuff. So what else can we do besides Culinary and the Bed Bath & Beyond? Well, we can use them as fire starters, or one that I didn't put in here was the smudge sticks. We see those being utilized quite frequently too, but you see different methods of making your own fire starters. You can use old egg cartons, or you can use toilet roll holders, paper towel holders. You can use lint from your dryer, all kinds of different ways that you can do that, but impart an essence in your fire. You can make your own Altoids, which is really cool, literally. One of the recipes that I put in here calls for gum paste, but you can actually purchase that at Walmart, just as an FYI. I actually looked online, pretty cheap, but you will have to have that to make some of these recipes, but really inexpensive to make those and pretty yummy. Of course, potpourri, and you can utilize all kinds of different things in your potpourri. You see some orange slices in there, as well as a multitude of flowers, and they're going to yield their own fragrance. You can usually keep those about 6 months before they lose their oomph. You can get creative with how you dry herbs. This one is made into a wreath, and then you can still utilize it afterwards, as long as you keep it clean. Or one of my favorites, if you've got chickens, grow herbs. They love to peck on herbs throughout the garden. Plus, you can put herbs in their nesting boxes, and that kind of keeps unwanted pests away and keeps your chickens healthier too. So what about some preservation techniques? Because we're kind of hitting all around the board, but hopefully you're seeing that simple solutions can exist and do come from the garden. And again, one of the biggest is going to be those herbal teas. You can use the chamomile to help you sleep, to an infusion of fresh ginger root. That was one we didn't talk about, but ginger is known to help alleviate stomach issues. And herbal teas are probably the most popular vehicle for, or modalities for, utilizing herbs. Nature's pharmacopoeia, if you will. But again, you're making that tea by steaming or boiling the leaves, roots or flowers in water, and then you just allow that to cool to a drinkable temperature. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. There's a lot of different herbal tea recipes included in tonight. This is a little bit better picture of a poultice that's used. You want to use dried or fresh herbs. It can treat various injuries from aches and sprains all the way up to bruises or even infections. Again, depending on what that issue is. Remember, we're going all the way back to number one. We want to research the herbs that we're using and know when the best time is to harvest these for the most potency. You just want to make sure that these are moist. You can see how this one's been applied. They've used gauze to apply it. Some will apply it directly to the wound. Sometimes even a poultice can again be just as simple as crushing those yarrow leaves or even basil leaves and applying crushed up basil leaves to an insect bite. Or if you've ever used a tea bag on a black eye, that would be the same principle. Again, bath salts, huge, excellent carriers of some of these herbs. You see here that this is a poison ivy bath salt. So lots of different, again, mechanisms you can utilize. We didn't talk about jewelweed tonight, but jewelweed is one of those, the wild impatiens or the touch-me-nots that is often used in a poison ivy treatment as well. But utilizing these will really help pull out a lot of infection. This is utilizing salt to preserve herbs. This is dill that you see pictured on the left, and then it's put through this salt preservation. So this is, you know, what they utilized in the pioneer days. We don't see this a lot today, but it does take a large amount of dill, because actually after 1 day of steeping it in the salt, it will be half that by the next day, and you'll have this liquid in the bottom of that jar, but you can still utilize that liquid too. You don't necessarily have to pour that out, but there's a recipe included in there how to preserve some of these softer herbs, especially like before frost, and then you can utilize these in recipes just like you would fresh dill, but just don't add any additional salt when you're cooking, because of course it's going to impart a little bit of that salty flavor, so just be aware of that. But lots of tender herbs can be preserved utilizing this mechanism. Do-it-yourself steam facials, excellent way to be able to use fresh herbs out of the garden. Calendula is going to be another one of those rose petals you see pictured there. Not only can it help with your complexion, but it also can help any kind of upper respiratory or bronchial type infections as well. So there's a couple of different recipes in there for various issues, depending on which one you need there. Freezing, probably one of the easiest way to preserve herbs. We saw that with the ice cubes a little bit earlier. So I put in some step-by-step in here so you can refer to it pretty quickly. But remember that herbs, they acquire their fragrance and their flavor from oils that are evaporating into the air when you crush those leaves. So that's where we're really picking up that essence. So we'll typically suggest utilizing fresh herbs for cooking, but you can retain some of those for later use. And they might not just be as fresh and flavorful right out of the garden, but some of these mechanisms are still going to give you that quick burst of flavor later in the season. So freezing, really simple to do. Again, step-by-step method there that you can refer back to. Drying has always been the traditional method of herb preservation. You'll notice there, if those herbs are clean, you don't want to wet those. Absolutely keep those dry. But if you do have some dust and dirt, just rinse them, shake off the excess water, and then spread them out to dry before you actually start the true drying process. Lots of different ways, again, that you can do this. You can tie the herb stems in small bundles. You can hang them upside down. You just want to make sure that you leave room for good air circulation around each bunch. You don't want rotting to occur if you get them too close together. There's some herbs that are going to be a little harder to dry than others. You see those listed there, and that probably makes sense to you. Basil, tarragon, and mints. They're going to mold and discolor fairly quickly, so you have to dry those pretty quickly. When you are harvesting, again, think about the dew versus the frost. UV rays from the sun and moisture from the dew or the frost can discolor and reduce the quality of herbs. So just remember that, as far as you don't want to be drying these in full sun. You can actually, as you're drying these, make a pretty presentation. You can dry these indoors in a large closet or an attic, an unused corner. Again, they can look pretty attractive until you're ready to use them. And again, putting them in the shape of a wreath makes it really pretty to look at. Oh, that picture's blurry. But you can kind of see how they've hung these in a shed or an outside barn. You can see they've got good air ventilation in there. This is an old laundry thingamajig, laundry rack. You can just use rubber band or loose string to tie those to that. You can see some different mechanisms here. And here they've just kind of retrofitted utilizing screen. Spread them out on a window screen and put them over sawhorses or on the backs of chairs. But just make sure that you're flipping these every so often. That's just making sure that you're getting even drying. And here's a look at how they've tied the paper bags. They may be collecting seeds, but just basically taking one bundle and putting a paper bag around each one of those, but you still want to give room for air circulation. Collect the seeds when they're completely dry, and then you want to store those in an airproof container and lightproof container. And this one, they've actually punched holes in it for a little bit better air circulation. You can use the microwave. It's quick and easy. So there's a step-by-step method in there. It's not my preferred way of drying herbs, but you can use just a single layer. I haven't tried one of those new Ninja Foodies. I'm hearing mixed reviews on those that actually have the dehydrator rack built into it. But it would, to me, it looks like it would be the same amount of area to use in a microwave and one of those. So I don't know, but drying is going to kind of vary with the moisture content of the herb. So you don't want to cook these, of course, to the point that they're brittle, because then they lose all their potency. So you want to do it in about 30-second increments. And again, that kind of depends on the wattage of your microwave. That's one reason I kind of steer away from that, because it can reduce the quality pretty quickly. Conventional ovens can be used. You can kind of see how they've got these staggered in here. You can spread those herbs out on cookie sheets and dry at the lowest temperature setting, which I think for most ovens would be about 200 degrees. Home food dehydrators are going to work well in these circumstances too. Just make sure that you follow directions on the dehydrator because they're all going to be different. And again, you want to make sure that you're flipping these from time to time. You can kind of see how those are already turning colors there. When you do get those, again, sufficiently dry, you can store these, and they're not going to yield the potent flavor that we would again get after, you know, fresh herbs, but you're still going to retain a lot of that essence. But just make sure that those jars or whatever you store them in are completely dry before you put them in there. Otherwise you can get mold growth, and that can happen pretty quickly, especially with some larger leaf surface area like the sage. And as far as storage time, you can actually keep some of those for about a year, as long as you're keeping them tightly sealed and away from sunlight. And again, you can kind of see even how bigger leaves are used. You can crush some of those. I didn't put a picture in here of the cayenne pepper that I showed you earlier, but even garlic, a lot of folks will dehydrate that out and use it as well. I made mention of the companion plants, so don't forget those. Go back to class 4 to learn how a lot of these herbs we talked about can be great companions in your vegetable garden. They complement one another. They enhance the flavor of your vegetable crops. They can draw in beneficial insects to the garden. They can help you build this biodiverse ecosystem. And then, of course, when you draw in those beneficial bugs, and they help eat the bad bugs, if you will. So eventually that whole point number 2, growing organic, is something you kind of come full circle with. So even if you're not utilizing your herbs in some of these ways that we've talked about tonight, you're still gaining some benefit just having them grow in your garden. So that is it for tonight, because I said I was going to be 45 minutes and I went over my time by 10 minutes. So I get started on these things, y'all, and I just can't shush. But I hope that tonight, I know there was just way too much information, and there's a lot of different ways we could take tonight's presentation if we want to, you know, delve a little bit deeper into some of this terminology and some of the methodologies, or even some of the plants. So really, I encourage you next week when you get that evaluation, if any of these classes, you know, anything that you just feel like you're missing or you want to learn more about. I mean, Russ has already hit me up for maple tapping trees. So, you know, there's all kinds of different things that we can do, and I'm open to that, but you gotta give me that information. So when you get that next Monday, make sure you put that in there for me. But again, next week, you're going to see a couple of these plants tonight. I think you'll find it pretty interesting. As far as the holiday plants, we're going to delve into some of the lore and some of the history, and kind of like we did Thanksgiving last week. So anyway, I did not have anybody watching the chat box, but I'll pull that out tonight and make sure we get comments shared with everyone and get questions answered, and I'll get that sent out tonight or first thing in the morning. And the video hopefully will be uplinked by tomorrow night. So if you are not in the Google Drive, don't worry. You'll get an email from me later tonight with a link to that, and you can access all of these classes. And supplemental material for tonight is already in there. Tonight's PowerPoint presentation is in there. Make sure you go view that. I didn't put all these recipes and things on a one sheet. I just kind of embedded them in the slideshow. And then, well, I've already closed out of that. But the next slide was actually resources and links. So lots of information in there tonight. So I will see you all next week, and I'll say happy Thanksgiving to all of you now, because we did our Thanksgiving last week. I guess I got those flipped. But anyway, we'll see you next week, and y'all have a great week. Happy Thanksgiving, y'all.